Hidden piece, implied conclusions and unstated assumptions. You know that arguments have three key pieces. 1, a conclusion. 2, one or more premises. And 3, a connection between the premises and the conclusion. Unfortunately, people do not always explain themselves very well, and one or more of these three pieces may be unclear or even left out entirely. In this module, you will learn about 3 hidden or missing pieces you should watch for when evaluating or making an argument. 1, implied conclusions. 2, unstated premises. And 3, missing connections. Implied conclusions. As a critical thinker, your task would be much easier if, anytime someone made an argument, they made sure to clearly and carefully state their conclusion. It would be great if every conclusion began with, "Therefore, I conclude that." Unfortunately, this simply isn't the way things work. People often fail to identify their ultimate point when making an argument. Arguments with unstated conclusions force the listener or reader to figure out what the conclusion was. Imagine you and a friend are discussing going to college. You go back and forth talking about what experience you'd have, how much it would cost, and what you want to major in. Eventually, your friend says, "The whole point of going to college is to get a job, and there aren't any jobs in history or literature or stuff like that." So what's his conclusion? It seems like he's implying that you shouldn't major in one of those areas because you wouldn't be able to get a job. But that conclusion is only implied. He hasn't actually stated it, and thus he hasn't completed his argument. Leaving a conclusion unstated makes it harder on people to analyze your argument. Essentially, you're making them do the work of figuring out what you're trying to really say. But it's also risky. If you leave it up to others to draw their own conclusion, sometimes they'll come to a conclusion you did not intend. It is not always obvious to the listener or reader what conclusion is being implied. For example, pretend you're having a debate with someone about what kinds of things should be taught in schools. You claim, "Schools need to teach the basics, reading, writing, and arithmetic." Your classmate counters, "No way. Schools also should teach kids how to be good people. They need to help them develop values." "Oh, come on," you respond. "If schools are supposed to teach values, who gets to decide which values?" So what is your conclusion? Think back through the argument so far. You said schools need to teach the basics. Your friend said they also need to teach values. And then you replied with a question, "What values?" With your final statement, did you mean to conclude that schools should not teach values? They should only teach the basics? Or is your conclusion that schools should teach values, but they need to hire good teachers who can pick the right values? Or, alternatively, do you conclude that while schools should teach values, they should let parents pick which ones? If you don't actually finish your argument by offering a specific conclusion, then you leave it up to someone else to infer your unstated conclusion. If they guess the right conclusion, there's no harm done. But the conclusion they infer may not be the one you meant to offer. Then you got a misunderstanding. Unstated premises. While implied conclusions are problematic, unstated premises are even more common. Sometimes people fail to state a premise because it seems so obvious or straightforward that they simply forget to say it out loud or put it in writing. Imagine that you and a friend are going to a concert. When you get to the parking lot, you notice a sign that says, "Must be 18 or older for this concert." Suddenly, you realize that you left your ID at home. Out loud, you exclaim, "Oh no! You have to be at least 18 to get in." We have to drive back home and we'll be late for the concert. Your friend is confused. Why are we going to be late? We're already in the parking lot and we're on time. What your friend is missing, the premise that you failed to state, is that 1, you will need to show ID to prove that you're at least 18, and 2, you left your ID at home. The first unstated premise, that you will have to show ID, may be something you simply assumed everyone knows. The second, that you left your ID at home, is something you just thought about, and so you may have forgotten that you hadn't told your friend yet. Having those pieces of information is important for your friend to be able to make sense of your conclusion. Complex arguments involve a lot of different claims and pieces, and people often forget to include all of the specific claims or premises that build up to their conclusion. Sometimes we assume that details are obvious or known to everyone, such as the assumption that you must show ID to prove your age. So we leave them out. Assuming these details are obvious or known to everyone can be reasonable, but not always. The danger to making good arguments is that the premises that we leave out or remain unstated can be unjustified or unwarranted. For an unstated factual premise, how are you going to tell whether it's true or not if you don't know it's there? And if the unstated premise is an opinion, you don't have a chance to determine how strong or weak it is. It's much more of a challenge to think critically about an argument when the premises are not stated. Consider the following statement made by a professor. Allowing a student to take an exam at a later date would give them more time than other students to prepare for the exam. Therefore, I do not allow any makeup exams under any circumstances. What premise is missing from this argument? What has the professor assumed? The unstated premise in this case is that it's unfair to allow a student to have more preparation time than others have. This may seem like a reasonable assumption, but is it? Can you think of any possible ways to refute this premise and thus undermine the argument? What about if a student gets in a car accident and has to spend the day of the exam in the hospital? Is it fair for that student to get a failing grade on the exam? Remember that the objective of an argument is to offer the best possible answer or solution to a question or problem. The goal of critical thinking is to analyze arguments to determine whether they're strong or weak. And if your analysis leads you to decide that an argument is weak or false, critical thinking will help you find ways to improve the argument. We can only do that if we have all the premises in front of us, if we know each step in the argument, so that we can evaluate each premise and provide alternative premises, if necessary. And much like implied conclusions, if you do not clearly state all premises, then you are at the mercy of others who will fill in the blanks for you, and they may not offer the premises you intended. Missing connections. The final problem that can make it difficult to evaluate an argument is a missing connection between the premises and conclusion. Identifying connections is part of correctly identifying premises and conclusions. Remember that premises provide the support for a conclusion. They are the reasons for believing assumptions are connected to a conclusion in a certain way. When someone says x plus y and therefore z, we know that x and y are premises that cause z to be the conclusion. But the connection between different claims in an argument is not always obvious. So much so that it can be hard to tell which statement is the premise and which is the conclusion. Imagine you're researching internet use and you come across the following statement. It used to be that children spent most of their time playing outside. I know when I was a kid, my parents always made sure I was out of the house, getting to know all the neighborhood kids. Now, children today spend so much more time inside on their computers, online all the time. Kids today are much more lonely, and they don't know how to make friends. My kids hardly talk about any of their classmates, and they don't know anyone in the neighborhood. It is clear that there are two main claims here. One, that kids are spending more time online, and by implication, less time outside. And two, that kids are lonelier and don't have any friends. But which of these claims is the premise and which is the conclusion? Is the argument meant to be that because kids spend more time inside and online, they have trouble making friends in real life and thus are lonely? Or is the argument that because kids have trouble making friends, they then spend more time inside and online? These are two very different arguments about what is wrong with children's lives today, and they would lead to very different proposals on what to do about the situation. When you engage in critical thinking, you must take the time to carefully evaluate an argument, identifying all premises, conclusions, and the relationship between them. You must be alert for unclear and missing pieces. And if you believe something is missing, you have to ask questions. What is the real conclusion here? What is being assumed, and is that assumption valid? What claim is being defended, and what is the support for that claim? As you make your own arguments, you should make sure to clearly and carefully state each piece of your argument, leaving nothing for others to assume on their own. When arguments are carefully constructed, they're easier to evaluate, and thus easier to either accept, reject, or improve, and to put into action.